Hello and welcome to our webinar, Co-Responsibility and Conflict Management, Some Resources for Ministers. I'm John Sitko, Assistant Director of Programs at the Catholic Apostolate Center, and I will be one of the hosts for this webinar today. I'm pleased to welcome our presenter for this webinar, Dr. Mark Delmonico. He is the Director of the Office of Certification for Ecclesial Ministry and Service at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he collaborates with and resources a subcommittee of the Bishops' Conference, dioceses, and national organizations seeking to develop and enhance promotion, recruitment, formation, certification, and recognition of lay ecclesial ministers. Mark is also a professional theologian and ministry consultant for Catholic and Christian parishes, communities, and organizations with additional significant capabilities in project management, online media, organizational communications, and visioning. And we are pleased to have him with us today. Now, if you have any technical issues during this presentation, because there will be a discussion portion throughout, please send me a message in the chat box and I will try my best to assist you. And now with that, I turn things over to Mark.
Well, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everyone for spending part of your pre-St. Patrick's Day celebrations with me. Here we are on March 16th. Hard to believe we're already 3 months into the year, but so grateful that you spent taking some time to be with me, and I'm really grateful that we're here to chat about this very important topic, which has been actually a focus in a lot of feedback that I get in our ministry work with the USCCB, with the national organizations that support ministry formation that we work with. We often hear a lot of needs and concerns around how do I manage conflict in my ministry? And it's often stated in different ways, and people have that experience in different ways. So I'm really glad to be able to be here to share some feedback that we have received from some people who are experts in the field, and also all of you who are experts in your field of ministry as well. So I want to be able to share that and be able to also hear your sharings as part of this. With that in mind, I want to bring us first to a little bit of an opening meditation. I have here an image called Christ in the Winepress. And hopefully you're seeing that on the screen now. It's part of a larger illumination, iconography. But this is not a very well-known image, though it is very, very beautiful and very appropriate for our Lenten journey, as well as for the topic for today. The image of Christ in the winepress is, of course, an image of his passion. The winepress is shaped a bit like a cross, which he is supporting there, crossbeam. And literally, he is in the winepress being pressed out with the grapes that are there. And of course, the grapes, the image of his blood pouring into the chalice at the bottom, a sign of his being poured out for us in his passion and death on the cross. And this image has not been particularly used a lot in Catholic iconography. There have been other icons used, but it has had a sort of a history within the communities of the Protestant brothers and sisters, which is very interesting, that they would have preserved this in some way. But when I look at this image and I think about conflict in ministry, and I think about the needs of all that we've been through over the past year with the COVID pandemic and other traumas that we've dealt with in our society, this image is a striking one. And I want to also share, sort of as an opening reflection, this item, which is a quotation from Angela Chrisman, who's a professor of theology at Loyola University here in Maryland, where I'm coming to you today. This beautiful reflection on this image. Perhaps we can mine the church's tradition to discover new ways of viewing and reading this image. In the 4th century, Ambrose of Milan, St. Ambrose, in the Holy Spirit, likened the church to the mystical winepress. Similarly, Augustine exhorted his congregation to imitate Christ, the first grape, by stepping into the winepress and being ready for the pressing. By being a church gathered around Christ and which extends through time and space, the mystical winepress encourages all Christians to become ready for the pressing, and to share the gospel with a weary world that thirsts for the nectar of life. It's a beautiful quotation, beautiful image to begin our reflection on conflict in ministry and how to respond to it, how to understand it, and how to manage it. But I also think that it speaks to our current moment in ministry in so many other ways. But before I go forward on that, using that as an image, further in our reflections, I do want to take a moment to hear from you. If you want to pull up your chat button, click on the balloon, the thought balloon that's there as the icon for it. Take a moment and put in the chat where you're from, where you're coming from today, which parish, which diocese, whatever you want to share there. And I'm going to sort of put that up here as well. I'm going to stop the share so I can see what you are entering. So take a moment just to put in the chat box, click on the chat balloon in your Zoom and indicate where you're coming from. Oh, San Antonio represented. Oh, Rochester, New York, not far from where I grew up in Utica. Richmond, Virginia, wonderful. Syracuse, my home diocese. Folks from the Archdiocese of Baltimore, that's where I'm coming from you today. I'm in Baltimore. Welcome. Chicago, wonderful. Ah, another Utican here. That's wonderful. DC, excellent. Well, we've got some folks from the Midwest. We've got folks from the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, and I see we've got Florida here represented as well. Anybody from the western coast or the mountains with us? I see some folks may still be coming in, so we may have a chance to hear from them too. Wonderful. All right. Thank you for sharing that. It's good to know where people are coming from. I have a second question for you, so keep your chat open. What two words or phrases, short phrases, come to mind when you think about your ministry over the past year? All that has happened over this past year, the unique circumstances. What two words, maybe it's just one word or a phrase, doesn't have to be two. What comes to your mind? What most pops in there when you think about the past year? So let's take a moment and hear what people are saying about that. All that has happened here through the pandemic, through the many circumstances we've experienced. Disrupted, very personal. You can feel that. A need to adapt quickly, my goodness, yes. 3 exclamation points on that one, yes. Challenge, amazement at what our parishes have done. What a good point to raise there. People have made personal connections, not the easiest thing to do when we're all stuck at home. An adventure, a roller coaster. Yes, yeah, I mean, we're following like the trends of COVID, up and down, up and down. The box is burned. What an interesting point. Be interesting to hear what, from you later on what that could mean. Uncertain, disrupted again, that uncertainty. Those types of experiences, really do, I think, capture well a range of our lives over the past year. And especially in our ministry, as we've sort of had to do this on the fly, literally, in so many ways for so long. All right, one last question for you, just again to get to know who's out there. In a few words or a couple, whatever makes sense, what would be most helpful for you when trying to address challenges you face in your ministry? Again, you may not have an immediate answer to this, or you may have a broad answer, a thought, a broad perspective, or something very specific. But if you had the ability to have one thing that would be most helpful to address the challenges you face today, what would it be? What would it be? Real support. Goodness. The need for support is so important right now. Having more of the right people to help us be more agile in technology. So people still struggling with that learning curve of trying to utilize technology in the best possible way, even though we know its limits, we want to try to do better with it. Dealing with the naysayers regarding change. Oh, yeah. You know, the time-honored phrase, we've always done it this way, doesn't work anymore, right? And so how do we help people see and grow into that reality? How to balance speaking directly with speaking pastorally during a conflict. My goodness. Yes, that's hopefully we can give you some info on that, Ben, today. And hopefully give you some resources you can keep working on. Radical candor. Wow, that's a nice phrase. I appreciate that. You know, it's a real challenge to do that in a way that's both helpful and pastoral and builds the relationship and moves it forward. But thank you for coming, and hopefully we can be of some help to you today. Really grateful for that. Thank you for those answers. Thank you for participating in that. Cooperation, excellent. Really, really grateful for this openness here today. The candor you're bringing is evident and helpful too. So thank you. Thanks for answering those questions. It's always helpful for me as a presenter to know where folks are coming from. So hopefully it can be a good tie-in to what we're going to talk about. So looking at today, I want to just highlight 3 takeaways, what I hope will be part of the presentation and also an opportunity where I hope you can take away something from yourself, for yourself as well through conversation. Look at briefly ministry considerations in this era, this time, this era of social traumas and change. I call it traumas because I do think the experiences we've had over the past year have been traumatic in ways that we are still unpacking. In that context, I want to bring some resources, not just the conflict literacy and management stuff, which is the core today, but just also highlight some of the work that I do at the Bishops' Conference with the Subcommittee on Certification for Ecclesial Ministry and Service, which is certainly one of the longest names in the conference for sure. How we are trying to help with resourcing for ministry formation, ministry ongoing development, all the ways that we work with others and provide ourselves resources that hopefully you can find useful. So I'll pass through those fairly quickly so that we can get on to the core of today's presentation, conflict literacy and management in light of formation and ministry needs. So people preparing for ministry, people engaged in ministry trying to build their skills, people encountering needs where this is an important piece for their work, which really is in any ministry. We want to be able to talk to those 3 things. So first, let's talk about where we have been and the impacts on ministry from COVID-19, from the sort of traumatic realities around race and racial injustice, systemic racism, these issues that have come up over the past 14, 15 months since, and now almost a year to the day where we've locked down 1 year ago. There are a lot, and I'm only going to name a few. You may think of others, so put them in the chat so others can see those. Since I'm sharing my screen, I can't see them right now, but I think that they will be valuable if you share them. Or you may agree or disagree with these. Coming to terms with a disembodied sacramental reality. Even though many places we now have churches open, there are people going to Sunday liturgy again, participating directly. We have still an enormous audience of people. Not an audience, really. They are the assembly. They are the people. They are the church that is scattered, that is not yet in place where they can gather together with one another to participate directly in the Eucharist. That is such a big and monumental challenge for all of us. You know, people mentioned, you know, the need to adapt and sort of the disorientation of this experience. How things were going along, maybe not as great as we wanted, but we maybe felt we had things working pretty well, and then all of a sudden, they are not. Nothing is working well. Nothing is as it should be. And everything we've done in ministry is sort of overturned. These are, you know, again, I ask you to look at these through the sort of pastoral lens of traumatic experience and what that means. You know, so we have this lack of clarity. What works now? we think we have a sense of it in some places, maybe less in others. How well are things working? How long is this going to go on? We seem to see a light at the end of the tunnel, now, more closer than we think we've ever had before. But that doesn't mean that everything is going to go back to the way it was. So finding new things that work, and how they work and how well they work and what that means for us pastorally, theologically, etc. That's an ongoing set of conversations we're hopefully having in our ministries, also in the larger church. Again, I bring us back to the idea of trauma. When people experience trauma, whether it is in this sort of slow-rolling, terrible catastrophe that we've had over the past year with the numbers of dead from COVID and people critically ill and sick and needing to tend to, children's needs, schooling needs, job needs, people being unemployed, people losing their jobs. That's a collective trauma. It's very personal in some respects, and it's also communal. And when trauma occurs, one of the things we always know is that we move to, on the hierarchy of needs, we move to survival. We move to the things we need to do to survive: food, water, shelter. What often takes what used to take not a lot of thought now takes a great deal of thought, and all of that takes energy away from ministerial creativity at a time when it seems we most need it. That can also be a very big source of not only challenge but also of conflict among our peers. We know, again, the job losses for especially lay ecclesial ministers has been real and troubling. Those who remain find that their job has sort of shifted under their feet, and they're not sure of themselves. They're not sure if they're going to continue to have a job. There are limited resources, all these things that continue to build that in. We know the church has for a long time been dealing with the reality of clericalism, not just from clergy, I might add, from laity as well, where there is this sense of a focus on the priest, not that they're not important, not that they're not absolutely essential or valuable to the life of the church, but that they become the sole focus, and that becomes a source of real challenge. There are a lot of social conflicts, obviously, that we've unearthed over the past year, or I should say, seen with new clarity, because they've always been there. For youth and young adults, these are particularly important, whether it is environmental justice, racial justice, whatever issues that form the core of social challenges. Many youth and young adults find themselves involved in those in some way, engaged in some way, and our ministry needs to speak to that in some way. And finding the way to do that often can be challenging. And again, you may have others which you're sharing in the chat. I invite you to think about that with me. So I want to go back now, having gone through that really challenging list, to sort of say, what does our inspiration, what inspiration do we draw from Christ in the winepress and that quotation that I shared at the beginning? Just a few of my thoughts. Again, you may bring others to your own thoughts and hearts as I go through them. But, we find ourselves in the midst of being shocked and surprised and disoriented by the trauma around us and within us. And we don't always necessarily see where God is. But part of that is that we understand that God is present. We do not lose track of that. Christ is in the winepress with us. But still, God is asking us to maybe go where we didn't expect to, or do what we didn't anticipate doing. That's the experience of call. The divine calling is still present. God is still speaking to us as a church, as individuals, as persons, as groups. We are being called to do things in new ways, which is often, as you will find, a call story in the Bible. You will find someone at the end of that call who needs to do something different. God is saying, go do something else, whether it is Abraham or whether it is Ruth or whether it is Isaiah or whether it is the disciples whom Jesus calls. We find that that's a part of our experience as a church and as saints in the household of God. Good questions to ask ourselves is, like, in the midst of all that, are we seeking to protect ourselves? So if you use the image of the winepress, are we protecting our cluster of grapes? Or does God invite something else? Are we called to surrender in a different way? These are, again, just questions for spiritual reflection. in the midst of trauma. Certainly we may feel crushed by the divisive realities in church and society. We may feel that acutely in our church at times as well. But go back to the image of Augustine. How can we be the nectar of life in the midst of that? What can we do differently? In the end, we want to influence others and sort of build a church and community together. When that happens, we often find ourselves perhaps in conflict. We can still be the nectar of life, even if we feel like we're not at an institutional level where we want to be, or at a parish level where we want to be, or at a church level where we want to be. We can still do something. How do we listen and respond to what God asks of us through others? That's a big piece of this conflict skill set that we're going to sort of look at today. What does it mean to do that well? And, to end on a hopeful note, God promises to be with us and that it will all work for good in the end. So if it isn't yet all good, it isn't the end. We are still on the journey and God still is with us. A good image and for us to think about during these Lenten days when we move towards Holy Week and towards Easter. So again, you may have other thoughts on that. I welcome you to reflect on them as we move forward here. But the second part of the presentation I wanted to again briefly go through here. I'm going to sort of move through these slides more quickly just so that we can get to the core parts of our conversation. Is what are some of the resources that are out there already that can be a help in times of like this, traumatic experiences in ministry, reorientation in ministry. I refer people back always to this wonderful document from the Bishops' Conference in 2005, Co-workers in the Vineyard of the Lord. Using the winepress image, it's a great image. When the bishops worked with theologians, pastoral ministers, and others, sort of discerning together how the Holy Spirit was at work developing lay ministry in the church, not just in 2005, but for decades prior to it, coming out of the Second Vatican Council. They eventually produced this document, which we still have today, and which, while bears the mark of its time, and much has changed since 2005, is still a very fruitful document to read and reflect on. We've just celebrated its 15th anniversary. 2020 was not a year where we could do as much as we wanted to with that, but we hope to continue to promote it and share it, and hopefully build on it. This is not sort of a set in stone document. We continue to interpret it, build on it in different ways. But I do want to make you aware of the fact that it can be a great resource for collaborative ministry with clergy and laity. So I encourage people to read it, take time to consider forming a study circle in the parish staff, maybe read that or in your community, wherever you are. Take some time with this document. It is a really real gem and a real treasure. Now to share a little bit about our subcommittee. As I mentioned, I work with the Subcommittee on Certification for Ecclesial Ministry and Service. It's a subcommittee of the Bishops' Conference that works specifically in the area of promoting and developing and supporting ministry formation and certification for ministry. And we do that by working with diocesan programs and ministry organizations, and building on what co-workers called us to do. So I'm going to play this video, which is of our chairman, Bishop Gerald Kikanis from Tucson, to just a 2-minute video to really talk about what it is that we do and why we do it in light of what co-workers says. So I'm going to share this now, and hopefully you will hear it loud and clear. Oops. Sorry about that.
When the bishops passed co-workers in the vineyard, it was a clear statement on their part about the importance of lay ecclesial ministry and the need for the laity to take their place alongside priests and deacons in carrying out the ministries of the church. not because of a shortage of priests, but because of the call of the baptized to use their gifts not only in the marketplace, in changing our culture and society with the gospel values, but also in the context of the church. And I think when bishops made that clear statement about the value and importance of lay ecclesial ministry, it was with the awareness that lay ecclesial ministers, like priests, like deacons, need to be well prepared, need to have the competencies and skills necessary to serve God's people. And certification was one way of assuring the fact that people aren't just going into ministry willy-nilly, but they are going in prepared. They're going in ready to respond to the pastoral needs of the people that they will serve, whether it's in youth ministry, whether it's in hospital ministry, prison ministry, whatever, in the wide range of ministries that exist in the church. The call for certification was an awareness on the bishop's part that as we entrust now the work of the church to lay ecclesial ministers, we want to be assured that they are qualified, capable, and ready to take up that ministry.
So I hope all of you heard that very clearly. And I see a few things in the chat here. I'm going to try to push that off to the side here. But it's a wonderful summary that Bishop Buchanan gave us of that work that we do. And again, I'm going to go briefly through the next couple of slides here, just to highlight some things that I think are helpful for the larger conversation we're going to have. Mostly in terms of highlighting the fact that in the midst of this very challenging time, we do have resources available to ministers for all sorts of needs. Whether it is talking about the different aspects of formation that co-workers highlights, which also I will point out are the same areas of formation that the program for priestly formation encourages as well. That formation is not just an intellectual exercise, but it is also one that deals with the human person, all of who we are, what we bring to ministry, our spiritual journey, our spiritual connection with God, what that means and how we relate that to our ministry, as well as to pastoral skills, which is kind of what our focus is today. How do we deal with conflict in ministry in a pastoral sense? So, but all of these pieces go towards that formation, and it's important to keep all four of those in mind. In some of the ways we've worked over the years, you can see just an array of activities that our bishop subcommittee, as well as other bishops' committees, have been involved with. Some of the fruits of that in terms of our relationships with these wonderful groups, including the Catholic Apostolate Center, who we're happy is sponsoring this today, and just other places where I know, just from engaging with them and from the work our subcommittee has done, that these are very quality connections. These are the organizations we encourage people to go to and to find resourcing for ministry needs of all sorts of different types. So I encourage you to do that. We've had long-standing support within the Bishops' Conference from various committees across the entire breadth of the conference, supporting this work of ministry formation and certification. So we're grateful for that. Here are some of the dioceses and some of the national organizations our subcommittee works with and which have approved certification standards, as well as some of them that are in the process of submitting their standards for approval by us. That process really gives us a chance to both see the good work that's being done, affirm it, and gives them a reference point to say, you know, the Bishops' Conference has looked at these and has said that they meet best quality standards for helping form ministers for today's needs in the church. So again, encourage people to take advantage of any of those places where you are. I know I saw a couple of people from Chicago, so make sure you check out our folks, our friends at St. Meinrad's and the work that's being done through the Lay Ministry Formation Institute there. Another great group of 5 organizations that form the Alliance for the Certification of Lay Ecclesial Ministers. Many of you may have some familiarity with at least one of them. Again, I just am so proud of the work that they've done over the past year, resourcing their members, building up resources online and in other ways, switching to virtual conferencing, all sorts of things that they've done to help meet the need of people today. And even groups like NCCL have undergone a complete sort of restructuring, and they're now focused in a different way under a new title in Word and Witness. So just that there's all sorts of opportunities out there, and that these groups really have been doing this for a long time. These are some of the standards that are approved by the Bishops' Conference from the Alliance for certification, just to give you a slide that shows the breadth of them. Again, going through these quickly. So why are we here today? Well, it started from work the subcommittee did in 2017 to 2020 in its strategic plan, which it does in conjunction with the entire Bishops' Conference every 4 years. One of our activities was to, according to our plan, conduct a dialogue to identify, promote, and share best practices in conflict management and intervention for conflicts between clergy, religious, and lay ecclesial ministers, or laity in leadership roles. So the fruits of that are in this webinar today. In last March, our subcommittee invited Dr. Ann Garrido, professor at Aquinas Institute, to discuss conflict literacy and management in light of the certification competencies that the Alliance, who I just showed you, developed. And she also led a workshop on suggestions with the USCCB staff, which was very well received. Dr. Garrido is the author of Redeeming Conflict, 12 Habits for Christian Leaders, a book which you should put on your Easter reading list, and also share with others and put it on their Easter reading list, because it is a very accessible, very wonderful resource. Some of the material from today is based off of. So I again encourage you to look that up. There will be links at the end of the file of the slides for that as well. So March was, of course, a great time to get all this wonderful information, and then, of course, everything shut down, and we had to go into emergency mode, as you all did, responding to COVID. So when September rolled around and the subcommittee met again, we said, hey, this is still wonderful stuff. Let's find a way, as we sort of return to some normalcy, to share this. And so the fruits of our labor are here with you today. I'm happy to be presenting on this very topic and giving you, at the link Jonathan provided earlier, both the copy of these slides, as well as a PDF of information from Dr. Garrido that places her expertise in ministry, negotiating conflict in ministry, in dialogue with some of the standards for ministry formation that have been developed and approved by the subcommittee and by the Alliance. So with that in mind, some of the reasons that we need to address it, I think, are obvious. I'm going to pass over those quickly, only to get to the main part of our work. So for this section, again, you may want to click on that link for the PDF, have it in front of you, print it out, something as we go through these, or just take notes and look at those later. But I wanted to highlight 6 different points, which I hope will be a place of starting small group conversations in breakout rooms at the end of this that will help maybe address some needs that are really present within your particular ministry context. So these are broad presentations that I hope will meet some needs within your specific work. And maybe at the end of that, we'll have a little time to share a few words about those conversations. But let's take a look at some of these resources. Number 1, from Dr. Garrido. We have to recognize and avoid in our ministry patterns of triangulation. What is that? Which it's a pattern of avoiding direct conversation with those we are in tension with, and instead favoring talking about our problems with others and trying to get them on our side. Okay? She notes that triangulation flourishes in contexts where people value kindness and where they feel they have little access to official channels for getting things done. Now think about that. Think about your ministry. Think about your ministry experience and your work. Where do you see those patterns? I guarantee that you see them somewhere. If you don't, I would say you're probably not looking hard enough. And if truly you can't find them, then I want to hear more from you, because you have a great ministry context, and we should all learn from you. But we know often enough that If I have a problem with my colleague in ministry, it's often a temptation to go to the person in charge and say, hey, I have a problem with so-and-so, instead of going to the person and say, look, I'm having this experience, what can we do? So how do we get out of those? How do we see those patterns when they emerge and get out of them? And again, this is looking at it from the standpoint of ourselves. We know others need to improve in these areas too, but if we wait for others to improve, the situation may never improve, and we want to make sure that we're taking the initiative as best we can to respond. Number 2, hold with curiosity different perspectives and ask questions to deepen understanding. How do we hold our own stories in conversation with other stories and come to greater clarity about the differences we see? This, of course, presumes, that we can understand and recognize that our story and our experience is not universal, and that others come to the same set of concerns, facts, needs, perhaps differently than we do. It isn't simply about saying, well, we disagree on facts or whatever, but that we just may evaluate things differently. There are more intense versions of that where we can't even agree on facts, which we all know about in our society today. But within the context of people on a ministry team, you sort of presume that there is a desire to have that clarity, desire to learn from one another. And if there isn't that desire, of course, that's part of the challenge as well. But this process sort of requires the ability to adopt a stance of curiosity. We have to listen well, ask questions that illuminate, and try to summarize what we're hearing without judgment. Now, look at all those verbs again, and look at all of those activities. And for those of you who have had any experience in pastoral counseling or working with others in counseling, you'll recognize that process very well. It is, in fact, what is considered as important skills in the ministerial act of offering pastoral guidance and counseling. So we need to sort of do that amongst ourselves as ministers as well. Number 3, an ability to distinguish between intent and impact. If we have good intentions, we think that the other person should recognize those good intentions and therefore not be angry with us, even if they were impacted negatively by our actions. This is Dr. Garrido saying we often respond in this way. But on the flip side, if we've been badly impacted by another's actions, we generally are certain in our anger or our frustration that they intended to hurt us. So we oftentimes will not make that distinction ourselves. So if we can't do it, we have to recognize that sometimes others can't do it. Part of the way we respond to that is to say, recognize that in doing a certain thing that caused a problem or an issue or a conflict, that someone's intent may have been very good. But sharing with them how that impacted you or impacted the situation in a way that you see may be negative can be helpful. Alternately, it's also possible that others will bring that to us, and we should be able to again say, okay, can we understand that you intended one thing but something else happened? Therefore, what can we do now to go forward from that? Number 4. And again, I selected these from among several that Dr. Garrido has on that PDF. So I'm just picking the ones that I think might be most helpful for us today. Number 4 is a capacity to frame in terms of contribution rather than blame. She notes that, if we operate out of a paradigm of blame, those organizations that do that have low morale, low productivity, people work in silos rather than collaboratively. I think, again, perhaps you can see your own experience in ministry in these broad strokes. Effective conflict management tries to reframe attributions of blame, and asks questions like, what contributed to this happening? What can each of us do differently so that we don't keep getting stuck? Again, it sort of presumes that people want to contribute to problem solving and more significantly than they want to blame other people. That may or may not always be true, but the fact of the matter is it should be in our minds to try to frame things this way, and that each of us needs to somehow adjust or change. That doesn't mean we have to each change equally, or that we each sort of meet in some idealized sort of middle ground, which that may not be the place where that works. It's more complex than that. There is probably something that each of us needs to change, but we need to sort of think about it together to understand that better. Number 5. This is a good, again, from the spiritual formation side of things. How do we integrate Christian practices and ritual around forgiveness and repentance in all of this? Dr. Garrido reminds us from a faith stance that neither of these capabilities, forgiveness and repentance, is a human capacity, but it's rather a divine capacity that God shares with us. That capacity is what we call grace. Conflict formation works in harmony with the human and spiritual formation to develop capacities for forgiveness and repentance. These are not often natural tendencies. The reality of it is that we're more likely to hold grudges and fail to forgive and fail to seek, repentance and forgiveness when we need to. It's a reminder that we all have work to do in this area, and that in order to develop that capacity that God gives us as a gift, we need to think about how we cooperate with that capacity, how we build the skills that allow us to do this. And then to tie it in to the fact that we are, in our essence, in our sacramental life as a church, rooted in the consistent reality of being forgiven and welcomed back by God. Penance and Eucharist, those sacraments play a big role in that. So what does it mean to think about those conflicts you're thinking about now in ministry in your experience, and how do they relate to the divine reality, the divine grace of forgiveness and repentance? And again, I don't think that there's one way of relating those two realities to any conflict. It is always an ongoing effort. And then last, the fact is that there are skills in conflict management, and that requires, sort of building those skills to focus on solving problems, generating, a cooperation around interests, rather than getting locked into positions. There is a whole range of literature that Dr. Garrido refers to from the Harvard Negotiation Project, two of which these are not specifically religious documents, but they are very, very astute documents about how to build what the Harvard Negotiation Project authors refer to as negotiation skills, but which really are conflict management skills. We want to try to go in a certain direction. How do we take steps to get that kind of agreement when there is conflict? How do we get past circumstances where people in our leadership roles may be saying no to us all the time? What are some of the things we can do? And there's all sorts of acronyms here, ZOPAs, BATNAs, etc., that are all part of that sort of skill set. But again, it's recognized that this is a very wide field of interest, and that ministers can draw from it, because this type of approach is quite compatible, in fact, with the work we do in ministry. So how do we establish next steps? Though that, again, is not something that happens automatically. It takes time, it takes reflection, and it takes skill. So those are 6 areas that I know Dr. Garrido highlighted for us. I want to take some time now to bring you into the conversation through small groups. We have a good chunk of time here, and I want to invite you, in light of what I talked about, maybe in light of some of the things you see on that document, how has conflict emerged in your ministry, especially during these difficult times that we've talked about since the beginning? What's most helpful in looking at the conflict management skills that we've looked at to maybe begin to address that conflict that you're experiencing more effectively? Is there one thing or a set of things that you see that's helpful? And then as we come back, maybe to wrap up our time, what's one insight from your room conversation that you might want to share in the main group? And maybe one person can highlight that one thing and help us by talking about it or putting it in the chat when we return. So again, what conflict has emerged during this time? What's been most helpful in some of the skills and ideas we've looked at today to maybe address it? And what's one insight from your conversation that you'd want to share when we return? Those are three things. We'll put those in the chat as people go into those rooms, but I know Jonathan is going to be working hard to get us into those rooms as well. So with that, I wish you well as you go into those rooms. You should see a note on your screen inviting you to a room. Go in peace, and we will see you shortly. Welcome back. Welcome back. It's good to hope the conversations you had were fruitful. As you're thinking about what maybe to share in the chat room, and we may have some time for some Q&A as well here in the few minutes we have left. Want to optimize our time. But I do want to point out a couple things. If you're looking to read more from Dr. Garrido, you can get her book from Ave Maria Press. The links are here and in the PDF of the slides. I will mention too, there's a great study guide that goes with this Redeeming Conflict book that's free and downloadable from Ave Maria, as well as a guide for pastors and preachers, again, completely free. You do have to pay about, I think, $10 for the book, but it is money well spent for sure. This book was a book of the year from the College Theology Society in 2016 because it is so eminently practical, and I encourage you to enjoy it. All right, so let's take a few minutes, either sharing information from your groups or questions in general. Let's open it up so that we can spend a few minutes here at least in conversation with one another. And then you can look at all the stuff I didn't talk about on the slides of the PDF later on.
Hi, Mark. I wanted to ask a question just so it gives people a few seconds to write in the chat. But what would be, I'm sure this is a popular question a lot of people have, is what are some first steps that someone should take if they've participated in this workshop, but want to bring either their pastors or fellow parish staff along with them in improving their conflict management in the organizations from which they work?
That's a good question. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's sort of like, I think the first step you need to do is sort of like think about your situation as in, more specifically. Where is the tension you're feeling? Is it with the pastor? Is it with a superior? Is it with a colleague who's at the same level as you? Is it with volunteers that maybe are supervised by you? Where's the circumstance? And then see who's sort of involved in that and where, you feel you're comfortable bringing that conversation either to them or seeing what steps you might take among colleagues that you trust to sort of suss out what might be good next steps, sort of in light of what we talked about today. You may say, I really want to avoid not, entering a communications triangle or triangulation, but you may not be sure how to do that. And that's okay because it's a skill. It's something we have to develop. But taking the time to maybe talk with others who you trust might be a good starting point, and will give you some foundational footing to stand on in the specific situation you're in to maybe apply some of this stuff.
Just as another question, given your role and given the changing role of lay ecclesial ministers in the church over the past year, but realistically the last 15 years, what are some trends and resources we should all be aware of, whether we are religious or lay people?
I think I would highlight a couple. One is that, the sort of changing, face of ministry, both in terms of its demographics. We've become a much more diverse church, not we are becoming, we have become a more diverse church. And that cultural awareness, that ability to relate across cultures is going to become more and more important. So whether you are clergy, whether you are laity, whether you are religious, this area is of a pronounced need right now. And it isn't just specifically one culture, although the development and growth in Hispanic ministry among the Latino and Latina communities is very important. It's not exclusively that, but there are some great resources. Again, I point to our colleagues in the USECB Cultural Diversity in the Church. Their committee has a wonderful resource on building intercultural competence for ministers, which I highly recommend. That's one area. The other area I would think too is just that we've highlighted, necessarily because of theology, because of needs around understanding roles, the differences over time between the role of the clergy and the role of lay ministers, for example. Co-workers does that a lot. What we're seeing now is just this overwhelming need, especially as we try to figure out the new ministry landscape post-COVID, of saying we need to find ways that we as a pastoral team, a pastoral leadership team, work together as a ministering team. And beyond that, how do our places of worship, how do our parishes support the type of outreach and engagement, either whether it's with the disaffiliated, whether it's with those on the margins, whether it's with those who are outside of our sphere in the parish itself? How do we become a community of outreach and care? Those are some of the trends that we continue to see and which we want to continue to promote. And one last one I'll just say quickly is finding ways to make sure that all those at different levels of ministry, whether they're volunteer, whether they're in the process of becoming professional, or whether they are leaders themselves, receive the sort of type of formation and resourcing that they need to continue to grow and become better ministers. Those are some of the key ones. Does anybody have anything to share from the groups themselves? Anything you can take yourself off of mute if I think that's possible, or just highlight any points that emerged as helpful within the discussion.
I think they are talked out at. Oh, here we go.
Oh, hey, well, that's one of the challenges with these formats, isn't it, Susan? We get going and then we're all done. But hopefully it was helpful for the time that we had, and I'm glad we did that. And hopefully it gives people an opportunity to continue to realize, if we take away from this, that it's an important area where we all continue to need to grow. Particularly now, particularly in the moment we're in, how do we find our ways forward in the midst of conflict, knowing that we're not always going to solve every problem, or we may dialogue, but we may not agree all the time. But we can try to find ways to meet common interests, which we all share in the life of the church, rather than focusing just on positions. If we take nothing else away, I hope you can take that away. Oh, something else here. Communication, process, and change management. Goodness, you could have given a whole hour just over to discussion of change within the institutions that this is all precipitated, for sure. There's more to be said there.
Well, Mark, I think we're pretty much at that time. So
Yeah.
I want to thank you for presenting, and thank you to everyone who tuned in and joined us today. We'll have a recording of this webinar uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next week. So keep an eye out there and on our website, CatholicApostolatecenter.org, for the link. You're welcome to share it with anyone you like. As always, all of our content is free to share. If you haven't yet found us on social media, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and in the hope of that we'll continue to reach more people with the spreading of the message of the gospel. In the words of St. Vincent Pallotti, may the chariot of Christ urge you on. Thank you, and God bless.
Blessings on your Lent, and happy Easter.